looking in terms of the national security, innovation, and economics is also a critical part. So in the first panel, we were looking in terms of the competition and cooperation between the US and China, which in many ways is sort of like the center of gravity in this sort of like a new period of great power competition. But one thing that came up in the discussions in the first panel was the role of the other major powers of Europe, the European Union, of Japan, and also of Russia, and what are the roles of these other actors, and what and how do they shape what is going on now and over the long term. And we have with us four experts who are going to provide us very useful and insightful perspectives from the European, from the Japanese, and and from the Russian perspectives. And we also have a discussant who also who's expert in this area. So what we'll do, I'll introduce each of our presenters and discussants when they come on. So we're going to begin looking first at the European perspectives, followed by the Japanese, and then the Russian perspectives. So so we'll begin with Sophie Meunier, who's a senior research scholar at the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University, and she's also the co-director of the EU program. She's focused in particular on these issues, and her current research deals with the politics of investment screening mechanisms, especially as it relates to Chinese direct investment in the European Union, and shows she's very much looked at these geo-economic, economic statecraft and national security issues. So over to you, Sophie.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my
screen. Hopefully that works.
Share my screen. Hopefully that works.
Great.
Okay, hopefully you can see. Oops.
Yes, I can see it. Great. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. So thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me to this conference. I wish I could be in person. It's always a nice place to be at EUI. So today I'm going to talk about the end of naivete in European trade policy, which is something that Commissioner Thierry Breton actually mentioned in his opening address this morning. I woke up very early to watch it. Assertiveness and geopoliticization in EU trade and investment policy. And if you wonder what that picture is right there on my screen, it's a picture I took of the Princeton University campus under construction, and that I think symbolizes the level playing field actually quite well. And that's something I want to talk about. Okay, so we've heard a lot in recent weeks, unfortunately, about economic statecraft being deployed by the EU right away against Russia in the case of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, so sanctions, cancellations, etc. And that's not surprising, since the EU is first and foremost a trade power. And indeed, most of that international power that the EU has had for a long time is exerted through its trade policy. That's something that your EUI colleague, Calypso Nikolay and I have written about for decades, actually. But so today I want to focus on a maybe less well-known area of EU economic statecraft that started before the Russian war and is actually in direct response to China. And that dovetails nicely with the presentations in the previous panel that we just heard, especially about the United States. So EU trade policy has long been based on multilateralism and on the use of commercial instruments to further good governance. That's the basic of EU trade policy. But in recent years, the EU came to see these liberal guiding principles as increasingly as a burden in face of this liberal international economic order that got weaker and weaker, and an increasingly unlevel playing field, mostly because of China, but also to some extent coming from the US. So a key moment, I argue, in this EU thinking about how it positions itself in using its trade policy and its economic policy for political purposes comes in 2017, when the then EU Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker said, "We are not naive free traders. Europe must always defend its strategic interests." And so it's this end of naivete that's basically starts in 2017 and has been reinforced since then, that marks a real shift in EU political and ideological views towards globalization. It's this realization that other countries are not playing fair, that economic relations can be weaponized, and that if the EU continues to try to lead by example, it's really putting it at a disadvantage. So since then, the EU has put in place what it calls a more assertive posture, and I think assertive is a code word for something else, maybe aggressive, maybe defensive, but definitely more assertive posture towards globalization. And that includes a whole new toolbox of tools of economic statecraft, which are designed to further the new EU goal of strategic autonomy. And the Russian war in Ukraine, I think, is only accelerating that transition. So the central question I'm asking here is why the EU has operated this paradigm shift, and why it's now using trade and investment instruments to confront other countries more assertively, especially China. And the main argument is that the shift really results from a confluence of both external factors and internal factors. So external factors, it's mostly by China, but also by the US being less committed to rules-based multilateralism, and also in important internal factors having to do with competence transfer in the EU and Brexit, and I'll explain. The challenges here are that these instruments address these level playing field issues and issues which are at this very increasingly porous border between economy and security, but it could easily slip into protectionism. And that's a concern for many people, both inside Europe and outside of Europe. And finally, I want briefly to think about the impact of the Russian war in Ukraine there, which I think is increasing the sense of urgency, as China might, as a result, gain even more ground more quickly. And also it raises all kinds of questions as to the limits of trade policy as geopolitical power when there's an actual hot war. Okay, so in February 2021, so very pretty recent, the EU released its new trade strategy, which was called an open, sustainable, and assertive trade policy. So the explicit goals there are to tackle all kinds of recent uncertainties with respect to globalization. So the pandemic, growing unilateralism, technological evolution, etc. Objective also is to deal with China. Another objective is to address climate change and digital transformation, and also to support the EU's drives towards strategic autonomy. So it develops a whole box of policy tools to support these objectives. And I'm only going to address a few of these tools today, but there are plenty more. So among these tools, which again are brand new, actually there's only one of these four I'm going to present, which is already implemented. The other ones are either just adopted or in the legislative process. So the first one is foreign investments, the foreign investment screening mechanism. We've heard about foreign investment screening a little bit in the previous panel. This is something that's brand new at the EU level. Investment screening mechanism, for those of you who are not so familiar with that, those are procedures designed to assess whether foreign direct investment transactions pose a threat to national security or public order, especially in sensitive critical technologies and infrastructure. And actually if you're interested in this issue, I've been working a lot actually on investment screening, especially with my colleague, Sarah Bauerle-Downsman. And I'd be happy to talk about this more in Q&A. So quick timeline, the negotiations for creating investment screening at the EU level started in 2017, again, after the end of Naïveté's speech that really launched the beginning of investment screening at the EU level. It was approved in 2019 and implemented in 2020. For those of you who know EU policy, this is an incredibly quick timeline. I mean, it never happens. I mean, it goes, you know, I mean, not never, but it rarely happens that something goes that quickly. Though the investment screening in the EU is a supplementary level that goes above the national screening and is a cooperation mechanisms between member states. This is not a European version of CFIUS, but you know, maybe one day, but not for now. So 1 year in, we already know that national investment screening mechanism have increased from 11 countries in 2017 when the EU started that, to 18 countries today in the EU that have investment screening, to 24 very soon. So another 6 that are in the process of doing this. So almost all EU member states in a few years will have investment screening. And in the first year, there were 265 transactions that were reviewed, coming mostly, you know, in order of importance from the US, from the UK, from China, Canada, and UAE, and mostly in manufacturing, ICT, and financial services. So that's tool number 1 in the toolbox, brand new. That's how the EU hopes to deal with these issues. Tool number 2 is anti-foreign subsidies regulation. So there's been this long-standing regulatory gap because inside the EU internally, there's very strict control of state subsidies, it's called state aid in EU speak, to ensure a level playing field in the internal market. But externally, foreign companies are not subjected to EU state aid rules. So this has created this gap where the EU has no instrument to prevent market distortions, which are caused by subsidies given to foreign firms by their own governments. And these foreign firms then compete with EU firms in the EU or abroad. And that puts the EU at a disadvantage. But this has existed for decades. What's new is that the EU is doing something about it. So there was a proposal that was issued by the Commission in 2021, by which the EU could monitor transactions, can investigate foreign subsidies, and even can adopt remedies. So that proposal is in the legislative process right now, but it has been named by the French presidency. So France has the presidency of the EU until June 2022, and they named this one of their priorities. Instrument number 3.
You have 2 more minutes.
Oh, sorry. Instrument number 3 in my list is the International Procurement Instrument, which has been adopted last week. It's brand new, which is designed to restore level playing field and introduce reciprocity in public procurement. And instrument number 4 is the anti-coercion instrument, which was proposed in December 2021, and enables all kinds of countermeasures in case the EU thinks that a foreign country is trying to take coercive economic action against a member state. And again, it's one of the priorities of the French presidency. So how do we explain that paradigm shift? Were there external factors? I'll go very, very quickly. China is basically, you know, the main reason. Every one of these instruments has been created in the shadow of China, as the US called it, a systemic rival. So investment screening, obviously, was created with this, anti-foreign subsidies as well, international procurement instrument as well, and anti-coercion even more so, especially again with the China-Lithuania dispute, but also the US, with the belief that the EU is no longer, the US, is no longer a reliable partner, and that the EU need more tools for autonomy. So some of these instruments are targeted at the US, others not, especially not investment screening. And there are also internal factors that explain what happened. One is that what I call the competence transfer, which is simply that the EU could not deal with these issues before because it did not have the authority, but since for that past few years, it has that authority. And the second one is Brexit, which basically removed one of the most free trading liberal states from the EU. So it changed the balance in the EU between those who are free traders and those who are more favorable to protectionism and industrial policy. The biggest challenge here in terms of policy is that there's this very fine line between assertiveness and protectionism. So some of these are economic instruments, some of those are more geopolitical instruments. Technological innovations have blurred the line between economy and national security, but the question here is how you avoid tilting that balance towards protectionism. Another challenge is what I call the commercialization of EU foreign and security policy. People talk about the securitization of economy, but here it's kind of the reverse. And it's always about competence, as everything is in the EU. It's because when issues of foreign policies are placed under trade policy, they no longer require unanimity. So they have different rules. So it's very interesting that the EU has been doing this. And finally, we can talk about the impact of the Russian war in Ukraine. But the biggest challenge of all, and that's my last comment here, is how can EU trade policy really be converted into geopolitical power? And there are some hurdles there. First of all, is that there are internal divisions in the EU as to how far it should go in employing these economic statecraft tools. Second is that EU trade leverage has weakened in recent years, in part because alternatives provided by China. And finally, because there's only so much trade policy can do when you have an actual hot war on your continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. That was a great presentation and a lot of sort of like food for thought as we sort of enter this new sort of like post-Ukraine era. So a lot of these issues that you brought up, especially in the last slide, is worth to consider and talk about. So now we'll turn to looking at Japanese perspectives. And to do this, we have Nikolay Murashkin, who's a research fellow at the JICA Ogata Sadako Research Institute for Peace and Development. Nikolay's research focus currently is on Japan's development cooperation and economic statecraft, the politics of connectivity, infrastructure, and finance in the Indo-Pacific and Eurasia itself. And so he's very much like looking at these intersection of these various issues that we've been talking to. So over to you, Nikolay.
Many thanks. Many thanks for having me and for inviting me. I will also share my slides. I hope you can see those. Is that all right?
Yeah, that's good.
Excellent, thank you. Just a short disclaimer, I'm a researcher of Japanese foreign policy and Japanese politics, and I only represent myself. I do not represent any organization or Japan, of course, as a country or society. I'm just a person who researches Japanese foreign policy. So my perspective is on Japan, I'd say. And I've tweaked the title a little bit, sorry, given myself that liberty. And it's still, the content is the same, but basically three main points that I would like to explain before I proceed to the main part is, so the Indo-Pacific vision is a vision, is a concept of in the Japanese foreign policy of the free and open Indo-Pacific region. When I say covitivity, it's a portmanteau that I've created referring to the pandemic's economic consequences and their impact on connectivity. And I will talk more about connectivity later on. So that's what I mean by covitivity. It's this general macroeconomic context of the tectonic changes that we're facing and how they impact connectivity. And then I talk about infrastructure. Infrastructure as technology, the export of infrastructure, especially that of connectivity, so transport and so on. As well as its financing, so concessional lending and so on and so forth. So with that in mind, I'll proceed. This paper is so far more of a brainstorming conceptual paper because what I'm seeking to do is not so much to make an empirical contribution. The empirical side of Japan's FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific, is evolving in real time, and there's a lot going on. But currently in this presentation, I'm more interested in locating that in that sort of conceptual context, and that's why I will try to locate it in the theories of Charles Kindleberger. Hopefully, I'll get to it on time. So the very shortly, the presentation has, 4 parts. In general, I'll start from the very general notions of connectivity, infrastructure, finance, and their role in international politics, meaning the gradual politicization and geopoliticization over the past decade. Then I'll get to more about who the players are, and especially what about Japan? What are Japanese foreign policies in development cooperation and connectivity infrastructure, and what drives them? Because I think one of the key issues here is the interplay of 3 groups of factors driving Japanese policy in that field. And those drivers are, we can group them as neo-mercantile, sort of neo-mercantilist, economic statecraft. They can also be another part of economic statecraft as something geostrategic, so security oriented. And then also you have this sort of developmental side per se, because Japan is obviously known to be a major development aid power, and infrastructure is one of the key areas in that profile that Japan has in the international aid landscape, which Japan calls development cooperation rather than aid. And as I've mentioned, connectivity is that sort of context that we've been witnessing over the past few years, that are the disruptive effects, and also crises and opportunities for major players to harness the major players, including Japan, potentially to harness their infrastructure potential into foreign policy. And then, I'll try to get to Charles Kindleberger ideas about that. So in general, the word connectivity might have different meanings. It can be a bit of a weasel word sometimes because it's sort of very generic. But if you sort of try to trace the literature on connectivity, or even on international political economy, IPE, connectivity really starts looming large around 2010, the late 2000s, and other bigger topics like free trade and or investment dominate the debates beforehand. But it's in the 2010s, and especially in Asia, that we talk about connectivity. And I think there was a paper published 2 years ago that I'm quoting here that really kind of neatly nailed it, saying that the link between geopolitics and connectivity becomes most obvious in a couple of successive initiatives in East Asia and also the EU that illustrate the geopolitical turn of connectivity politics over the last decade. And so it matters what different actors mean by connectivity. And well, here you can see sort of more technocratic definitions of connectivity. I will not bore you with them, with the details, but this one comes from the G20 summit in Japan in 2019 from the Infrastructure Connectivity Development Working Group. So here it's not a very politicized idea. It talks about networks and hard and soft dimensions. Then, just as I mentioned, what I mean by connectivity infrastructure is often transport, so railways, waterways, maritime ports, airports. You might say, a lot what the Belt and Road Initiative has to do with. So this is just to disambiguate. And then you have connectivity language and wording permeating various doctrinal documents or documents of international organizations, the ASEAN Connectivity Master Plan, and then you have the same thing with APEC, and this is a trend of the past decade as well, especially. It comes to the fore. The infrastructure finance that I think is an important part, because we're not talking just about technology, the export of infrastructure and building it, but also about funding it and financing it. And that's the financial power that countries like Japan have. And this, again, ties into Japan's traditional historical focus of foreign aid or development cooperation, which regionally has been focused on Asia, sectorally on infrastructure. And then in terms of funding, the loan share, the share of concessional lending has been particularly high as opposed to, for instance, grants, although grants were also always available. But Japanese infrastructure funding, and especially aid in general, is loan heavy, well, also because it is infrastructure oriented. And well, why does it matter? You can have sort of replies from development economists who might tell you, well, we have all those beautiful examples of France in the post-World War II, or Japan on the Thailand seaboard, sort of a textbook explanation. And then the more we get into the global value chains debates, and especially the disruption by the pandemic, this is when connectivity matters for supply chain efficiency, especially if those chains are to be are being challenged and reshaped, disconnected and reconnected. Same includes resilience. And then there's the macroeconomic side of liquidity and demand for infrastructure. There's this famous quote from the Asian Development Bank survey from 5 years ago, roughly, that developing Asia will need to invest 1.5, 1.7 trillion dollars a year in infrastructure to maintain its growth momentum. And so you see that figure always often floated in the debates or scholarship on the Belt and Road or in Japan's infrastructure policies and so on. Now, I want to make an interesting sort of seg into history. So this is a rewind picture. I think it matters to see how sometimes infrastructure and its funding may have played, even if a subordinate role, not the main role, but some role in conflict in the past century. So one of the classic examples of World War I and the Anglo-German rivalry that has preceded it was the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. Again, not the main cause of World War II, of course, but it was a part of it. Then another famous example is the Chinese Eastern Railway that the Russian Empire has been building across Manchuria, and the sort of threat perception that caused in Japan, because Japan was fearing the Russian Empire advance towards Korea and Manchuria. Then Russia's entry into the Entente Cordiale in a way was also partly depending on the French financing, which actually was a lot of that was going to railways in Russia. And then you have scholarship about Japan's pre-war period by Aaron Moore, for instance, which talked about techno-imperialism, and by that he meant how infrastructure was used by the Japanese Empire before World War II and during World War II in Asia.
You have 2 more minutes.
2? Oh, sorry, I thought I had 3. Okay, thank you. Right, I'll skip the general context maybe to Japan part right now, because what matters is basically that Japan has been an established player in that field, and not only in terms of bilateral exporting infrastructure, but also in devising region-wide schemes for infrastructure. So when we see Japan's Indo-Pacific vision, it is rooted in a much longer context, which goes back decades. Now, some of those ideas were fruitful, some materialized, some didn't, but Japan has consistently acted as a sort of economic player, using its finance and infrastructure as a tool. You can see some examples here, but I can talk about more on that during Q&A, for instance. And the main part here is that probably the Indo-Pacific vision and the usage of infrastructure in it, as we know it today, often it is traced to Shinzo Abe's premiership, which started in late 2012. But really, we can even see the roots, the origins of Japan's active infrastructure promotions driven by domestic factors already in 2009, 2010. So what Shinzo Abe does is sort of continues and beefs up that already existing policy inherited continued from his predecessors. So there's a consistency there, and that's why it is limited. There is, of course, a China factor there, but it's not just about China. And the story here is that while under Shinzo Abe's premiership, so between 2013 roughly and 2020, the neo-mercantile factors have been really driving ones in that sort of tripartite interplay between development drivers, neo-mercantilist and strategic. And you can see it in the institutional design. You can see how the Prime Minister's office has been controlling very tightly infrastructure exports, and including specific deals. Now this is being reshaped with the new Prime Minister under the Kishida cabinet. And it looks like there will be less control by the Prime Minister's office of the infrastructure export. And that in turn might mean more role for developmental drivers and for drivers that are strategic. So there might be less of a neo-mercantilism, neo-mercantile drivers behind that. How much time do I have? Sorry, how much more time?
You have you can wrap up. You have about a minute left.
Right. Okay. Well, This is quite detailed, so I'll probably just get to Kindleberger right away, because the interesting point that he was making was this sort of theory of the how hegemons come and change, and how during a major crisis such as the Great Depression, if there is a sort of absence of if there's like a absence of a hegemonic stabilizing player, like a system manager, that might lead to major crises. So in his case, stabilizing meant concessional lending, counter-cyclical lending of last resort. But I think it's worth looking at infrastructure funding, especially as we've seen it increased over the past years, whether from China or from Japan or from other players, as a sort of exercise of that potential to act, whether as individual or a group system stabilizer. With that in mind, I'll probably close here, and I'll happily take some part during the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Nikolay. It's like another very interesting presentation, particularly focusing on sort of like the specific dynamics of cooperation in terms and stabilization in terms of connectivity and what Japan's role, which we see in competition with the Chinese and with the US also, and other countries beginning to step up on that. And that's a very sort of like sort of new perspective to that we'll look to talk about. And lastly, we'll turn to Marc Ozawa, who's a senior researcher at the NATO Defense College over in Rome. As I said, he's probably much in demand right now because his current research examines NATO-Russian relations, such as it is, hybrid conflict, and also on Russian and Eurasian affairs itself. He's like he's also part of the University of Cambridge mafia. He has a PhD, which Nikolay has as well. Given that I came from King's College in London, I'm always wary when we have too many Cambridge people on. But it's great to have your views, etc. And we'll look forward to your perspective, Marc. Over to you.
Well, thanks very much. And just for the record, I work with King's College London colleagues, so I have a great deal of respect and always enriches the discussion. And it's nice to see Nikolay again after some time. Yeah, so thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation to jump into this panel today. I also wanted to give a similar disclaimer that these are my own views. I work for the NATO Defense College, but these are not the views or the policies of NATO or the NATO Defense College. So we're an independent research group here. And with that said, I will try to share my screen. Let's see, I think that worked. Okay, so so the main points that I am going to make in my short talk today are that one, the Russo-Ukraine war is already impacting the energy security of the Indo-Pacific region through, in the first instance, oil and gas prices, plus the big question of future access to supplies. The second point is that questions of energy security are already beginning to divide the region geopolitically. On the one hand, in terms of support for Russia, and in this case, obviously that would be sort of China, and maybe tacitly India. Versus, on the other hand, support for Europe and Ukraine, as we're already beginning to see, not only through diplomatic statements, but also through the decision to reroute liquefied natural gas supplies to Europe that were destined for Japan, and also potentially South Korea and Australia. The third point is that the role of China and India remains to be seen, how this will reverberate through the region. I mentioned earlier that India has been sort of quiet at this point, and this harkens back to a policy that India has had towards Russia dating back to the Cold War. And then China, which at least in my view has been sort of playing a little bit of both sides. On the one hand, some statements of support for Russia, but on the other hand, some statements of concern and expressions of restraint. The fourth point is that sanctions and export controls will likely, even the sanctions that are already in place as a result of the annexation of Crimea in 2014, those will likely continue to slow down Russia's liquefied natural gas projects that are in the making right now. And the fifth point is that allies and partners in the region, and here I'm using, forgive me, sort of NATO EU speak. What I mean by that is allies and diplomatic and working group partners of North America and Europe may try to diversify their supplies away from Russia, much in the same way that you saw countries do after the Arab-Israeli War of 1973 and the oil price spike that happened when countries decided to shift their attention and their energy security away from the Middle East and towards the Soviet Union. Okay, so forgive me if this might be known to many of you, but it's worth revisiting some foundational realities of the Russian economy. The oil and gas petroleum sector is the largest by far sector of the Russian economy. This is, and between oil and gas, the largest part of that is in terms of oil and oil byproducts. Here you see petroleum gases as a category, and that's referring to natural gas. The other large sectors of the economy are also natural resources. And in return, sorry, I jumped ahead a little bit. So who are the main trading partners of Russia? By far, it is still Europe, especially if you include Turkey in this. And I apologize to my Turkish colleagues. This was a graph generated by UN Comtrade. But if you include Turkey with Europe, this is still Russia's largest trading region, although China is Russia's largest single trading partner at this time. And of course, the second largest trading region is Asia. I mentioned before the foundation of the Russian economy. With this graph and the following graph, I want to sort of illustrate a trading dynamic that has existed between Russia and its trading partners going back to the 19th century. Occasionally, Russian and also during the Cold War, Soviet leaders have tried to change the structure of the Russian economy, but it still remains fundamentally unchanged. Russia exports its natural resources and imports finished manufactured goods and also services. Just catch up with my notes here. Okay, so the oil factor. This is the Achilles heel of the Russian economy. Russia is very much dependent on oil exports. This is why the ruble is highly correlated to fluctuations in the global price of oil. Some have described Russia and the economy as a petrostate. The graph that I have here shows I've tried to sort of show the level of input into the Russian National Wealth Fund and also debits from the Russian National Wealth Fund as the price of oil has fluctuated. And with this, I've created sort of my own backhand calculation of what the break-even range for the Russian economy is with the global price of oil. I estimate that between $40 to $50 a barrel. It used to be between $50 and $60 a barrel, but particularly over the last 15 years, the petroleum sector in Russia has been modernized and has become more efficient. If you see now, at least the last time I checked a few days ago, Brent, which is the main European index for crude oil, was trading at $109 per barrel. So this is, of course, in a high oil price environment, this is very beneficial for the Russian economy. It's also important to note a few fundamental realities of oil and gas exports for Russia. One is the difference between how oil and natural gas are exported. It is much easier for Russia as a supplier and also, say, Japan, Korea, Australia, even China, to diversify their trading partners in terms of oil. Natural gas is far more difficult because it needs to be transported either by pipeline or in its liquefied form, which adds an extra technology and expensive processing step to the value chain. So, so these are limitations of the choices that Russia has in terms of its exporting partners, and also limitations that countries in the Indo-Pacific region will have. If there's a natural gas pipeline connecting Russia to your market, you're much less able to switch to different suppliers. A few things that I've been thinking about lately in terms of ripple effects in the Indo-Pacific region from the war in Ukraine. There are a lot of debates now about what sort of technologies, what sort of products should be either sanctioned or limited in terms of trade with Russia. Before the Ukraine invasion, I participated in debates about the effectiveness of Western sanctions on Russia since 2014 and the annexation of Crimea. And at that time, the prospect of a multilateral framework to really limit exports to Russia was seen as a bit on the extreme side of the spectrum. That is no longer the case. There's active debate about some sort of sanctions regime that would resemble what we had during the Cold War period. Some of you may recognize the term COCOM, the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls.
You have 1 more minute left.
Okay. So some open questions. The sanctions are still being designed, still being debated. What we've seen over the last few weeks is sort of the first wave of sanctions, which don't really target Russia's petroleum industry. And that's because, well, the industry was already targeted through the 2014 sanctions, and the only way to further limit that is to cut trade with Russia. And that's something that very few countries have the appetite for, because they're quite dependent on oil and gas exports from Russia. Here in Europe, there is the fear of potential blowback from sanctions, particularly in the fall of this year and the winter, if natural gas flows to Europe will be cut or not. And we're also starting to see, as I mentioned earlier, and as Ambassador Oe mentioned in the keynote remarks, some countries in the Indo-Pacific already stepping up to help address concerns of European partners. And if there's any big question about what will happen in the coming years moving forward concerning Russia's oil and gas exports, that is China. Ever since 2014, China has been able to step in place of international petroleum companies to provide the needed technology to develop Russia's liquefied natural gas sector. We see this in Yamal, the Yamal LNG station, and this could also be the case with Shell's exit from Sakhalin-2 and ExxonMobil's exit from Sakhalin-1. So with that, more questions than answers, but I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Marc. That was fascinating. I'm sure hopefully there'll be lots of questions, because a lot of sort of like what's going to be happening still has sort of like, we still don't know what's going to go on, but but you provided some useful sort of potential avenues itself. So now we'll turn to our discussant, who's Yoko Iwama. She's the director of the Strategic Studies program at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies in Tokyo, GRIPS. She also focuses on issues of maritime safety and security. And she's done a lot of sort of like work on European diplomatic history as well. You have 15 minutes, Yoko, to address all these questions, and hopefully you can sort of like provide sort of unifying themes that are worth discussing as well. Right.
Okay, do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Good, great. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this very interesting event. Of course, it would be much nicer to be in Rio. We're having wet weather coming, maybe snow in this time of the year, so it's kind of a bit chilly. I have a flowery background. Hope to cheer you up a little bit with that. First of all, to Sophie Meunier's interesting presentation, I have several comments on this. First of all, you said that EU is first and foremost a trade power. That may be so, but looking at the current situation, I think, Russia was not afraid of EU as a trade power. I think Putin was afraid of values that EU represented, the values and the soft powers. And it's kind of the ideology that's implemented in EU is that the deregulation of market and other things. And I think that was especially threatening for a power like Russia, where everything is sort of regulated and controlled and pinned down. So I think that aspect, the soft power aspect of EU, should not be kind of downplayed. I think we should value that a lot more. Now, all these instruments that you talked about, which supposedly is lifting EU out of naivety. Actually, I see a lot of parallel between what's happening to EU and what Japan is kind of slowly waking up and trying to do, which you called weaponization of trade or economy, but I don't think what is happening is kind of offensive weaponizing. I think it's more defensive, that we are kind of trying to defend some vulnerable points in our society from aggressive and offensive behaviors of some powers. So I think these are more defensive than offensive measures that's happening. And this year we are going to revitalize our national security strategy in Japan, and there will be a lot of talks about economic security, but I think this is also not really weaponizing economy, but more protecting our socioeconomic structure, the vulnerable points, from offensive maneuvers of some powers. So I'd like to have some comment about that. Second question is, it's difficult to understand these mechanisms for an outsider because of this multi-layered structure of European Union. So I'd be interested in learning about some of these measures where it's really kind of possible for Brussels to kind of unilaterally go forward and tell the countries that, hey guys, we're going to do this way from tomorrow, now just do it. Or are the countries still able to say, well, that's fine, but we have different circumstances here, and then just evade it? That, you know, we see that happen sometimes in European Union. And then the third point is about United States. I can clearly relate to your description as China as a systemic rival. I'm not really sure about how, you know, where US stands here in this picture, where with sort of China and Russia is probably the offensive power, and EU, Japan trying to defend the weak points. And I'm not sure if US is a potential offensive power, or is it just a very weak ally that we need to pull together? Or, you know, I'm not sure about the place of US in this picture. Yeah, so that's about it. And I all in all, I think what you said is very valid. But I think there are rather more defensive than offensive measures when you talk about security. And it's really the offensive power of EU lies in, as I said in the beginning, values and soft powers. Because you said somewhere that there's only so much trade policy can do in a hot war, but there's only so much that bombs and bullets can achieve. And in the longer run, I think it's values and stronger institutions that really achieve the objective. Okay, that's for the first presentation. Then I go on to the second presentation from Nikolay Murashkin. Thank you for the very extensive information and connectivity. My comment is, yeah, there's a lot about connectivity in both EU and Japan, and we are even trying to somehow connect our resources to better counter the Chinese effort in this. So my first question would be, you know, how do you assess the possibility of connecting the connectivity projects of EU and Japan? Second comment is that I teach international relations history, and I also talk a lot about Kindelberger. But also when it comes to connectivity, I think the really important thing is the shift or the revolutions in information and transportation that occurs once in every century or so. So the last time we had this really jump was at the end of 19th century, where you had railways connecting everyone, and then sea routes connecting the continents. And then you had the information revolution of first the newspapers, and then came the radios. So I think these kind of connectivity really changed the world. In that respect, I'd be interested in knowing if Japan's doing enough to kind of relate to the information aspect of the connectivity. And then if you look at the physical sort of transportation connectivity, building roads and railways are important, but you also need to break down the legal and regulatory barriers as well. We've seen the regulatory barrier kind of suddenly go up because of COVID. And we see it more than anywhere here in Japan, because we have so much difficulty getting out of the country and then coming back into the country. There's nothing different about the free democracy of Japan, but it's only the regulations that relate to kind of carefully going around with COVID virus that has put us into such an isolated situation. So I think it's also necessary to look at the sort of regulatory aspect or deregulatory aspect of connectivity programs. And if Ken Endo is still there, maybe he would like to say a word about that. So my last question would be, from all these aspects, how do you see Japan's programs and Chinese programs compare in the Asia, Indo-Pacific region? Okay, so that was for the second. And for the third presentation by Dr. Marc Ozawa, yes, this was very actual presentation, and every day we hear a lot about energy and our energy prices are going up. And especially because I studied post-war German history and all these pipelines, it was very, very relevant to me. One small question I have is about hydrogen. A lot of people talk about hydrogen as the future energy. Who is likely to benefit from this, and who is currently, to the extent that you can tell, who is ahead than the others on this perspective? And the second question is more kind of IR theory type of question. All these energy security makes me think about the interdependence theory. So you are economically interdependent, and what does it mean? And we know about the vulnerability and asymmetry of vulnerability. So when you think about Russia and oil and gas, especially Europe and Russia became more and more interdependent during the last 2 decades, I would say. And how did that affect the vulnerability on both sides? And what does it mean for the future of interdependence? Because, I mean, everybody reads this textbook by Nyan Cohen about interdependence and how it helps institutions can help us to live more peacefully with each other. But what happens to interdependence when a real war starts? You know, there's this theory that you can kind of promote peace through more interdependence, more commerce, more trading, and getting closer, still hold something for us in this very, very brutal time that we're living through. Thank you. That would be all from me.
Okay, thank you very much, Yoko. We have about half an hour, and I'll let sort of our panelists respond to Yoko, but I also wanted to open up the floor in the meantime as they're responding to our sort of like to the rest of the participants. Please send sort of your questions. We have the Q&A function, also the chat function, and we have a few minutes to be able to address those questions itself. But it's but let me sort of open up sort of back to our panelists, begin with Sophie, and then Nikolay, and then Marc to respond to Yoko. You each have about a few minutes. Over to you, Sophie.
Thank you very much. First of all, like my co-panelist, I should have put a disclaimer. It seems, obvious working in an American university, but clearly those views are mine, and I certainly don't speak on behalf of the EU at all. Second, thank you so much, Yoko, for your very, very thoughtful and thorough comments. So I'm going to try to answer them a little bit here, but definitely I will answer them more thoroughly in my brief. So I won't take them in the order you said. The first one, when you talked about the parallels with Japan waking up, but the fact that it was those tools, this brand new toolbox is really more about defensive tools than offensive ones. I absolutely agree. I agree with you, 100% there. What the EU is trying to do, I mean, the justification there is that there are two types of goals with these tools. One is to level the playing field. That's why I had that picture. So this is defensive, like others are not playing fair. The unfairness has increased in recent years. So all the EU is trying to do with some of the instruments like anti-foreign subsidies or international procurement agreement is to restore that evenness. And the second type of instruments are the ones that are designed to address those issues where you have this creep of national security and foreign policy into trade and investment. And increasingly how some countries, mostly China, are using those tools. And there again, this is about defensiveness, defense, like the investment screening and the anti-coercion mechanism. So I absolutely agree with you. There is I didn't have time to elaborate, but there's a very big ideological debate inside the EU between the member states who are divided, who've been divided for decades, basically in two camps. You have the camps who are the liberal free traders, and the UK was the leader of that camp, but that's also, Sweden and Denmark and the Netherlands, countries that really want to preserve openness at all costs, because openness is almost, openness has some other goals, but it's also a goal unto itself. And then you have other countries with probably France at the helm, who, because of their past experience with some degree of state management into the economy, are more open towards some form of offense and some form of protection at the same time. So that would be some degree of industrial policy, for instance, and a little bit more aggressive response. So what I was trying to say is that the reason why this paradigm has shifted in Europe was partly because the liberal free traders have lost one of their members, but that big difference still exists. So there is no real support for more offensive instruments at this point. But I think that the Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine may change the, and COVID to some extent as well, may change it at the margin, more support towards industrial policy, for instance. And another comment where you said it's really difficult to understand this multi-layer. That's the trick with everything in the EU. But to answer, short response to your question, no, the EU cannot impose these things on the member states. So all these four instruments I talked about have gone through or are going right now through an EU legislative process. So once they're adopted, they become part of EU trade policy. And trade policy is governed by majority rule in the EU. So whereas foreign policy is not. So if the EU wants to deal with an issue like Lithuania and China, for instance, which we didn't have time to talk about, if it's in the foreign policy realm, you need basically consensus from all the member states on how to deal with China there. But if it becomes what I call commercialized, if it becomes part of EU policy, as it will be now with the anti-coercion instrument, if it's adopted, then you only need majority because trade rules are different. So it becomes easier for the EU to respond. A side note here on the investment screening mechanism, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about how it works. As I said, this is not a European version of CFIUS. It's a layer that's on top of the national screening mechanism. And what it did is that it forced more than half of the member states who did not have investment screening to adopt. It didn't force them, but it really encouraged them to adopt one. But it's just on top. It's an additional layer. So it does not replace. And in the end, the way the legislation is written now, the ultimate decision to accept an investment or not, in the end, remains with the country who's the host of the investment. So the EU cannot force a country to reject an investment, or another member states cannot. But there's much more cooperation, and the EU oversees now the review of these investments. If I still have a minute or two, I want to address at least the US question. So I hope I did not I did not misspeak. And I'm not saying the US is a systemic rival to the EU, but there's a strong feeling that especially blossomed during the Trump administration, that the EU definitely needs to become more autonomous, because you never know, you cannot take the US for granted. And first of all, because the US has been weakening multilateralism. It even started to some extent before Trump, but of course this was completely heightened during the Trump administration. And the EU trade strategy relies a lot on multilateralism. But you had, the first day in office where Trump withdraws from the TPP and then, stops the negotiations for TTIP, and then literally actively tries to block the WTO. Through the appellate body being paralyzed, and all of this. So the Trump administration kind of showed the EU a glimpse, I think maybe a glimpse into a future or an alternate future of what the US could be. And this is not a reassuring one for the EU. So I think a lot of people understand that the US there could be, post-Biden, there could be another US administration that goes even further than the Trump administration in trying to weaken the multilateral international rule of law. And the EU has to be prepared, I think. So again, this is not saying that the US is a systemic rival. Transatlantic relations are certainly much better now, they're in a good state. But the EU is projecting itself in the future and is thinking about this. And last point about the EU as a trade power, I agree with you that the soft power is what Russia is probably the most worried about, but the soft power of the EU comes from its trade power. The two are completely interconnected. And the EU has been using for decades, has basically been using its trade policy in order to try to change the rule of law issues and governance issues in other countries. So it's been using these carrots and sticks, offering partnership agreements, accession, the carrot of accession as well. But it's always been based, first of all, on access to the internal market and everything else that goes with it, and on the export of norms, but a lot of norms that are related to the internal market as well. And indeed, the 2014 already crisis in Ukraine was provoked in large part by that partnership agreement with the EU. So I agree with you, it's about soft power, but I think the two are completely interconnected. Thank you very much. Those were great comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. Now we'll turn to Nikolay.
Many thanks, Iwama Sensei, and I also really appreciate the very thoughtful comments, very much to the point. So I'll begin with the first one, comment and question about EU and Japan. I think the question about connectivity programs of the EU and Japan depends on a number of things. Well, one of them would be the regional scope. What region are we talking about it? Are we talking about? Because even if we take just Japan solo, something that I'd like to highlight was that so over the past decade, you had those infrastructure export strategies formulated and promoted by the cabinet of ministers in Japan, and they preceded the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy as such. So between about 2010. Let's say between 2010 and 2012, you have the Democratic Party of Japan with its package type infrastructure strategy. Then you have the Abe cabinet's infrastructure export strategy between 2013, 2016. Then in 2016, when free and open Indo-Pacific gets properly announced, it's then that the infrastructure export strategy gets segged gradually into this Indo-Pacific vision, initially as some sort of linkage, and then ultimately, I think, last year, in 2020, when the infrastructure export strategy was revised under the Suga cabinet already, I believe, this is when it mentions that realization of FOIB is one of the objectives. So but what I mean by this is that initially when it all started, when the infrastructure strategy started in Japan, it was even using the term Asia-Pacific. It was not using the term Indo-Pacific. And where I'm heading with this is to, again, back to the question, where is there an overlap regionally for EU and Japan? So if it's the Indo-Pacific, well, then you have, I guess, in the EU, different players of different countries, member states have different levels of activity in the Indo-Pacific. Of course, you have France and Germany being very high profile, to some extent the Netherlands. But then I wonder to what extent that might vary depending on the player. And then, of course, yeah, Japan also in the Indo-Pacific. De facto, the infrastructure export strategy of Japan was from the beginning mostly targeting Southeast Asia, South Asia, and those areas predominantly. So the question is how much overlap there can be, perhaps in the Pacific and so on. And because we're again talking about the EU-Japan relationship per se, it would be logical to think about Eurasia as the sort of natural space where you might have a lot of connectivity. And that's where we get brought to the inevitable questions of how the ongoing events, Russia-Ukraine, I mean, how that's going to impact. Because on the one hand, you have the China factor in the EU-Japan relationship, so the Belt and Road, which of course would be connecting, was supposed to be connecting a lot of the corridors between China and the EU, including via Russia. So that the question is how that's going to work, if at all, or how in the future. Likewise, for Japan, for many Japanese logistical companies, the Trans-Siberian, not only the North Sea Arctic route, the maritime route was important, but also for the Trans-Siberian was important too. So then the question what's going to happen to this in the light of sanctions and the ripple effects of the past 3 weeks, and then there will be another question whether EU and Japan would seek to act as a sort of socializing actors of socializing rising powers, whether it's China or any other country, whether they would like to pursue balancing, as sometimes Japan has tried to do in Eurasia by helping some states to diversify their export routes and corridors. So that's on the first question. And yeah, I have unfortunately more questions than answers there. But I think what we've seen in the case of the Asian Development Bank, where Japan's role is quite prominent, was that at some stage, the ADB was sort of seeking to rather help diversify the export routes of, say, Central Asian countries away from Russia, like, I don't know, 15, 16 years ago. But in the past years preceding the pandemic, the ADB tried to be sort of a bit more inclusive of players like China. And you can see how inside the ADB, China's profile was raised when it comes to Central Asian affairs and corridors in the Central Asian Regional Economic Cooperation. And a lot of the institutions that weren't previously involved were started being mentioned as potential partners, Chinese institutions or Russian institutions and so on, and by this time in development finance institutions. But one obvious avenue of cooperation would, of course, be co-financing, I believe, to share and diversify the risks. I would not have specific examples for now, but EBRD does participate in some programs that the ADB has been launching. So I wonder if that might be a precedent continuing in the future. Now, your next question about whether Japan is doing enough to relate to the information aspect. Yeah, to me, I'm not sure I might be out of depth to do justice to this question, because probably this would have to do with the 5G infrastructure and telecoms infrastructure, which is something I haven't researched, to the necessary depth. But one story to follow there, of course, the sort of watch the space kind of flag would be the economic security bill that is currently, I think it's in Japanese parliament. It was approved by the cabinet of ministers in late February. So going back to this idea of securitization. Now that security bill talks about critical infrastructure, especially I think inside Japan. So it's more about the sort of inbound and protecting, as you mentioned before, what's inside Japan from adversarial influence by whatever power that would be. I'm not sure yet to what extent that bill will affect the export, the sort of outbound strategy of Japan's export of infrastructure, and that itself is subject to probably redefinition by the new cabinet, the cabinet that has been in power since late 2021. The point about legal and regulatory definitely, barriers definitely does matter. Again, the economic security bill comes into mind here. And I would also probably seg this question connected to the final question about comparing Japanese and Chinese programs. I think one of the features of Japan's development cooperation or foreign aid when it comes to infrastructure was that Japan's infrastructure aid, Japan's contribution to foreign aid in other countries, was not only to the specific tangible assets, roads and so on, bridges, but also to the administrative and legal infrastructure. So legal ODA and administrative ODA was traditionally consistently a part of Japan's foreign aid, and that is likely to continue. That has been highlighted early on. I remember JICA doctrinal documents from, sorry, not doctrinal, but JICA documents from 2004, I think, as early as that, where they highlight the importance of legal infrastructure. And that's where I think in comparing Japan and China, that's where the question of normative power comes up. So to what extent will those two powers want to act as a normative power? We've seen some intent to act that way in the case of Japan, the United States, and Australia, as seen in the Blue Dot Network initiative, which has seen some trouble in materializing. So we'll see how that works in the future. On the other hand, what China did, which was interesting, was the establishment of Belt and Road courts, the international sort of commercial courts. I think they were supposed to be in Beijing, Xi'an, and Shenzhen. So for the maritime Silk Road and for the Silk Road economic belt. But I think also this is something which was very early stage. It was met with some skepticism because of the way the institutional design of those Chinese courts was set up, in that they would be operating in Mandarin. The judges would be appointed mostly, within China by Beijing. So The question there was, how much of a normative power China can exercise to settle potential disputes within Belt and Road.
Okay, can we wrap this up? We have to.
Okay, yeah. I'll probably just stop there to not to take too much time. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Nikolay. Sorry, we're a little short on time, so I'll now turn to Marc.
Okay, thank you for your comments and questions. I think I'll go in reverse order because I just finished marking down some notes and I ended with the second question, so that's sort of fresher in my mind right now. Interdependence theory. Up until 2014, this was probably, from my experience, the dominant view among the EU's DG Energy office and among the main European political actors, with the exception of those in Eastern Europe for obvious reasons, and the UK, which had the luxury of having its own petroleum supply, so it wasn't as dependent on Russian supplies as the others. And this view harkens back to, I think the first version of this was the German Ostpolitik, Wandel durch Handel, and the views of interdependence with Russia in the post-Cold War era were that despite the energy dependence that Europe has on Russia, Russia is equally, if not more, dependent on Europe, and therefore it creates sort of a balance of interest that no party will do anything out of unexpected or too unexpected. I think that things started to change in 2008 after the Russo-Georgia War. And there you started to see more critical voices in Europe come out in concern of Europe's growing dependence on Russia, particularly in terms of natural gas, for the reasons that I mentioned in the presentation, that once the pipeline infrastructure is constructed, that's it. In the petroleum industry, they say that oil trade is like dating, but natural gas trade is like marriage. You can't get out of it as easily. And this is why Nord Stream 1 at the time in 2008, when it was being constructed, was so controversial. This became, the concern was elevated for obvious reasons in 2013 and 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. We see that with the US and EU sanctions. But Germany was still a strong holdout of this view with respect to Nord Stream 2. There were, less attention on the other European partners from the Netherlands and France that were also part of this consortium, but Germany was still the main proponent of this. So over time, you see these two sides of the debate, the emphasis shifting in European circles. The US and to of course, Canada, the North American side, has always been very critical of this view of interdependence. And I would admit that it's possible to argue that events over the last 15 to 20 years could have unfolded differently were this interdependence not part of Russian leadership's and also European leadership's equations. One can argue, and I remember at the time there was the argument that Russia stopped. This was in the context of the war with Georgia, that Russia stopped with the two regions, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and did not advance all the way to Tbilisi, although militarily they could do that because of concern about the future of the economy, about Russia's relations with Europe. And even after 2014, this sort of a legacy network of German diplomats, particularly from the Social Democrats, SPD, they sort of used their old relationships with Russia to free the oligarch Mikhail Khodorkovsky from prison. Their influence was very much part of the decision for Khodorkovsky to be released. So I would say that their interdependence theory is not invalid now. It still plays a role, but it depends on the issue. And even now that we're in a phase where war has broken out, there was a lot of concern a few weeks ago that Russia would turn off the natural gas. There was sort of this escalation of rhetoric, and that didn't happen. Russia is still now fulfilling its contractual obligations in Europe and in Asia. Not more, not giving that extra supply that it might do on an unseasonably cold winter, which is what we had in Europe this year, but it's still satisfying its contractual agreements. This may not be the case in other industries like aviation, where there's this question of these plane fleets that are being leased to Aeroflot, what will happen with them? So far, this is not happening in the petroleum sector. Some Western actors like Shell, ExxonMobil, BP, they have made the decision to exit the Russian market. It remains to be seen how that will happen over time. They've made the announcement, they haven't actually executed on it. So there are still some questions about that. So my response is that it depends on the issue, and we are sort of moving into kind of uncharted territory, testing the limits of the interdependence. And I think that we're starting to see where those limits are, but it sort of remains to be seen. With respect,
a couple more minutes left.
Okay, sorry about that long-winded answer. I'll be shorter with the question about hydrogen, because I've been thinking about that less recently. And my focus has been more on the petroleum sector rather than green renewables. But what I can say, and we're already seeing the effects of this in Europe, is that there's a much greater emphasis on accelerating the process of transitioning to green renewable energy in whatever form, and including nuclear. So some European states are reevaluating their phase out of nuclear in light of events in Ukraine. So I suspect that green renewable energy sources will be targeted for more subsidies in the near term to accelerate the transition. And those countries and companies that have already invested significantly in, say, hydrogen. And in Europe, Germany is sort of the dominant player in that type of technology. I would expect that transition to be faster, and those countries who have already invested in those technologies will probably have an advantage, and that would include Japan. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to everyone. I just wanted to sort of pick up one last point, sort of in the discussion between Yoko and Sophie. It was like, I mean, you were sort of emphasized sort of like that EU and Japan had a very much of a defensive posture, right? And it's like, and Sophie, you mentioned that sort of at the margins, the EU is beginning to do some offensive, etc., but it's not very much. But the question is, going forwards, is that going to significantly change? I mean, it's like given that we have authoritarian expansionism with Russia, the Ukraine, and the potential for Taiwan, etc. It's like, I mean, doesn't Japan and the EU, don't they have to really step up? I mean, it's like they didn't do so during the Cold War, where they left a lot to the US, etc. But as you sort of pointed out, you can't trust the US as much these days. So should we be thinking that sort of like the EU and Japan needs to be much more assertive and go on the offensive going forwards? Do you have sort of like a 30-second response, Sophie, and you?
Yeah, I think the EU is not there yet. It's not there yet. I think the Russian war in Ukraine may accelerate a little bit of that ideological shift. Again, may tilt the balance between the completely free traders versus the people who are a little bit more interventionist in their favor. So once that balance tilts, we may see a little bit more of this, but not yet.
Not yet. Okay, Yoko.
I think this relates to what we discussed about interdependence. It hurts us when we go on the offensive, so it's going to be more difficult. And then if you look at China-Japan relationships, it's not just a kind of commodities like oil or gas, which is kind of, you can find alternatives somewhere else if you try hard, but it's more kind of value chain and production intertwined. And if we are going to go on the offensive there, it's going to bleed a lot, and we have to think hard about that.
Yes, no, it's going to be very costly, but I think it's like these type of questions we didn't have to really think about before. Now I think this is why this type of conference will be very useful. But thank you very much, everyone. That was like a very sort of like fascinating, sort of insightful, and of course this is like hopefully we can find time in person, perhaps next year, back in Florence itself, that we can sort of discuss this much more in person. So thank you very much, everyone, and we'll look forward to continuing this tomorrow with the second day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye and good night.